Welcome to the Middle Ground Podcast, a podcast that highlights the middle ground of today's political world. Just saying no to the extremes. Today's podcast is called Projection. Hello and welcome to the breaking news segment of the Middle Ground Podcast. I'm your host, Zach Rosenfeld, and here are your top stories. President Biden today met with President Xi of China to try to find some common ground so that the two countries can have more military communication, as well as an effort to get the Chinese government to rein in some of the outrageous amount of fentanyl being produced in their country. I guess we have to hope that the talks were successful, but I generally would watch out for massive balloons. The Israeli Defense Force performed a raid today on Al-Shifa Hospital where they found weaponry that belongs to the terrorist group Hamas. Many on the far, and even not that far left, are in outrage that the Israelis would fight inside a hospital. However, we all need to remember that the base for Hamas is located underneath schools and hospitals, specifically to elicit these sort of reactions from the so-called human rights groups. So while it is Israel's duty to keep as many civilians alive as possible, Hamas purposely makes it very, very difficult to do so. U.S. Capitol Police says about 150 pro-Palestinians were protesting violently outside the DNC headquarters in D.C. Wow, violently protesting is always a sign that your side is correct. I guess that's why yesterday's march to free the Jewish hostages, which had nearly 300,000 marchers, was so peaceful. Look, I am Jewish. From my perspective, these so-called pro-Palestinian protesters just sound like anti-Semites. These crowds, these so-called pro-Palestinian crowds, are chanting all sorts of disgusting chants, which basically call for the annihilation and the genocide of Jews. And just breaking, the Senate has passed a short-term spending bill, pushing off a potential shutdown until next year. This is mostly good news, and it kind of shows that, can I say this? Mike Johnson, the new Speaker of the House, is a guy who maybe can be worked with. I have to say, I'm quite pleasantly surprised. Okay, so bad news. We didn't have enough time to edit the rest of the episode. Listen to the rest of this podcast at your own risk, but we will have a fresh new podcast completely edited and fully ready for your ears tomorrow, Thursday. Once again, this is Zach Rosenfeld with the Middle Ground Podcast. Stay strong and stay in the middle. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about Donald Trump. But first, let me give you an introduction to this podcast. This podcast is made to highlight the Joe Manchins of the world, and even the Mitt Romneys of the world. The people who, even if you might not agree with their views, they're moderate, and they aren't, crazy. They're not Rashida Tlaib, and they're not Marjorie Taylor Greene. And I think those people know what I'm talking about. Now, if one of those names that I threw out, when I called them crazy, that offended you, then this podcast is probably not for you. This is probably for people who could agree that both of those people are crazy, and this podcast is probably for people who would be attracted to the middle ground of politics, which, according to polling at least, is a pretty wide swath of the American people. And I feel like there's not enough media for that part of the American people, and that's why I'm here. So anyway, without further ado, let's get started. I will be having guests very often in episodes, but sometimes I'm just gonna bring you. I'm just gonna read stories from the day and break them down to the best of my ability. And you could comment and give feedback on the episodes if you have any feedback. Okay. I'm going to start off with Donald Trump. Donald Trump, he's always very quick to attack his political rivals, at times giving them childish nicknames. I don't think before him in politics we ever had Little Marco, that type of nickname. He consistently calls his political opponents crooked, and famously attaching those titles to former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and I think he switched it now to Biden, to President Biden. No, I won't really get into whether those titles are warranted titles, which I don't believe that those are warranted titles for either one of them. And whether he should have really called them crooks without waiting to see a shred of evidence to actually call them crooks, which he expects people to do for him. But I will go into the sheer irony of Donald J. Trump calling someone a crook. Not that long ago, a judge in New York ruled that Donald Trump committed fraud over many years by inflating his net worth and various properties he owned to all sorts of entities and banks. And this is the man, whose main insult to his political opponents is crooked. He's currently under indictment in the state of New York for falsifying business records. He was listed as an unindicted co-conspirator in the federal criminal charges against his attorney, Michael Cohen. This man's record regarding financial crimes is far from squeaky clean. So it's rather rich of him to call others crooked. And that's far from the only example. I mean, he routinely accuses Democrats, and especially President Biden, of weaponizing the Department of Justice. He claims that his indictments are simply election interference ordered by his top rival. Yet he doesn't have a shred of evidence that Biden ever ordered the Attorney General to investigate anything for him. His Attorney General, Merrick Garland, is among one of the most respected federal judges alive today, former federal judge. He was nominated to the Supreme Court, and he had bipartisan endorsements. Famously, the Republican leader Mitch McConnell blocked it because he was appointed before a presidential election. Now, it would seem highly unlikely that such a respected person would sully his reputation by just doing political indictments against the president's opponent. But without getting into that, let's just focus on the claim. Trump is accusing Biden of weaponizing the Justice Department. Does that sound familiar? Who would ever try to tell the Department of Justice what or what not to investigate? Maybe the man who ran on locking up his political opponent. Remember Lock Her Up? Or maybe the man who tried to fire Justice Department officials who were actively investigating him. James Comey, remember him? Or the man who tried to have an election he lost declared fraudulent by the DOJ, and the department informed him there was not a shred of evidence to support his claims. That telling the Justice Department who to investigate and who not to investigate, that's called weaponization. There's not evidence that Biden ever told them to investigate anything, or not to investigate anything. And yet he's accusing him of this while he himself actually, and these are known facts, that he ordered the Department of Justice to investigate all the people that he didn't like and thought were doing crimes. The Oxford Dictionary defines projection as the unconscious transfer of one's desires or emotions to another person. For example, a cheating spouse may accuse their partner of being unfaithful. This is a sort of psychological defense mechanism people use. Also, if someone is crooked and cheats in business, they may accuse others of being crooked and cheating. Someone tries to weaponize a government department, they may accuse others of doing the same to them. Donald Trump is a troubled man, and his own Attorney General, who helped him try to weaponize the Department of Justice, William Barr, noted, "Our country cannot be a therapy session for this troubled man. We don't have the collective strength as a nation to handle another Trump presidency. And just to give you a couple more examples, I mean, he's constantly calling Jack Smith deranged and a lunatic. Who does that sound like? Who's a deranged lunatic? Literally everything, quite literally everything that Donald Trump says is simply him projecting things that he does on other people. So, you know, it's difficult to watch politicians seem to have the same sort of maturity level and psychological healthiness of a of a deranged nut or of a honestly a sixth grader or fifth grader. Maybe I'm being too generous, but it's I very much dislike Bill Barr, but I mean eventually all his people eventually see the light after he turns on them, and when he says all these things like that he was a troubled man and the country cannot be a therapy session for him, then maybe we should take anyone's advice we should take it to the one who tried to weaponize the Justice Department against Democrats. If you can't take it from anyone, you should be able to take it from allies. So any Republicans who are listening to this, I'm not telling you to become a Democrat. That's not the point of this podcast. The point is that you should be normal. Everyone should be normal. But unfortunately, a big percentage of our country is. I mean, if you look at what's happening on college campuses, non-Jewish, it's hard for me to see all that blatantly anti-Semitic things going on college campuses among the far left. So if I could call out the far left, even though I'm a Democrat, really, then I think Republicans should be out there calling out the crazy people on their right, on their far right. Mitt Romney voted to impeach Trump after he saw the crimes that he did. And I think that Republicans should, he was the Republican presidential nominee. He can't be that objectionable to conservatives. I wouldn't think that he would be a rhino or a Democrat or whatever Republicans call him nowadays. Okay, so now that I finished with my political commentary, now we're going to get to the top stories of today, which is Wednesday, November the 15th. Stay here right after this break.